This episode of Small Town, Western New York, was made possible by the following supporters. Hi, on this episode of Small Town, Western New York, I'm taking a day trip to a place that's on the backside of a great renaissance. With a newly restored opera house and a revived Main Street full of cute little mom and pop shops, restaurants, and a regionally famous cheese shop, and you can add to that one of the prettiest lakes this side of the Finger Lakes, all tucked into the enchanted mountains, hills, and valleys of Allegheny County, well, you can't go wrong. I'm headed to the town of Cuba. The town has had quite the patchwork of territorial history, with the settlement of Cuba beginning in 1817. It was officially formed in 1822 from part of the town of Friendship, and then in 1830 was reduced by the formation of the town of Genesee. Then in 1835, Cuba was partitioned again to form the town of Clarksville, and finally, the village was incorporated in 1850. Cuba features two historic districts, the Genesee Valley Greenway, Seneca Oil Springs, the Cuba Cheese Shop, Empire City Farms, and of course, Cuba Lake. It's also been recognized as a Tree City. Like most of the small towns in Western New York right now, Cuba's experiencing quite the renaissance. It looks nothing like it would have a short decade ago. My first stop for the day was to meet up with Dave Crowley, Cuba's resident historian, to get a quick tour of the town that included stopping at the new historical markers they've placed along Main Street, as well as a few stops inside some notable buildings.
From Bath to Olean was the major thoroughfare for the pioneers. It was called the Bath-Olean Turnpike.
Okay. Wow.
And it connected by land the Susquehanna River watershed with the Allegheny River headwaters near Olean. And that was the migration pattern for the people coming out of New England that wanted to go west to settle the west.
After Dave and I parted ways for the day, I headed just around the corner down to the Cuba Cheese Shop to see just what this legendary place was all about. So what type of products can we find here, obviously other than cheese?
New York State cheddar, cheese curds, salt rising bread, jellies, jams, mustards, chocolates, gifts. Our main business is cheese. We have over 450 types of cheese.
And it's from, so is it only Cuba and New York State cheeses?
No, we import cheeses from around the world.
Okay.
We have a distributor down in New York City, but we do sell Wisconsin cheddar, New York State cheddar, locally owned
that's great.
cheeses in here.
Okay.
This case right here is domestic, United States.
Like artisanal type of stuff,
Artisanal cheeses, correct, yep.
Cuba Lake is perhaps the town's most regionally famous attraction outside of the cheese shop. It was originally known as the Oil Creek Reservoir, and it was constructed between 1852 and 1858 at a cost of $150,000 as a reservoir to feed the Genesee Valley Canal. And at the time, it was the largest man-made lake in the world. Sitting just 2 miles north of the village at 1,542 feet above sea level, the lake is actually the highest reservoir in Allegheny County and the 6th highest in Western New York State. Its surface area encompasses 454 acres at an average depth of 17 feet and a maximum depth of 49 feet. One interesting fact about the lake is that during the winter, it's drawn down by 6 to 8 feet. Surrounded by over 300 homes, many of which are year-round, the lake is a very popular fishing spot containing bass, walleye, and northern pike. Public access to the lake is permitted through a state-managed boat launch here off of West Shore Road. One of the great catalysts here in town that really helped solidify Cuba's comeback was the restoration of the Palmer Opera House. The goal here wasn't to modernize, but to restore and maintain, which I couldn't agree more with. The results are gorgeous, and the improvements are subtle, but they allow for a variety of uses, which was the original opera house's intent. Restoration projects of this scope and size always seem to have someone who is the primary catalyst behind the movement. And at the Palmer, that person was Mike Doyle, whose very first project was actually getting one of the largest flagpoles in the country erected in town.
This is the Palmer Opera House. It has sort of a long checkered history. In 1871, there was a different opera house on this site. It burned, but the firemen at the time heroically saved what they could of the buildings downtown here. Right. And Mr. Palmer, who owned the building, said, well, I'm going to build it back bigger and better than it was, in sort of to honoring the firemen. And so this place is the result of that. For here, this was a major cultural center. The schools used the auditorium for their graduation. The school at the time didn't have large spaces. They played basketball up here. This was the gymnasium. Political meetings, social meetings. So it really was sort of the heart of the community at one point.
So we had a fire, then we had a restoration, and then it was in use for a long time.
Yep.
And then how did it get into, it just fell into?
Well, I think, you know, as with many of the older buildings, their owners sort of extract their value by avoiding maintenance issues. And
which is horrible.
And it's terrible, but the local economy couldn't support the reconstruction of this building. And for a while, they were looking at knocking this down and making a parking lot. What we did was basically we hired some good contractors. They did the structural. Then we were about halfway through the project and we stopped paying contractors altogether. What we did, we had about $500,000 left, and we bought materials, and all the rest was done by local people. So much more has happened because of the Opera House. We really couldn't envision how much impact it was going to have. You can often look down through the downtown and every parking space is taken.
One of the top annual draws to Cuba is the Garlic Festival. I spent an entire afternoon there checking it out along with thousands of other happy Western New Yorkers who came out for the event. As you just saw, the home for the Garlic Festival is here in the grounds of McKinney Stables, which the locals call the Block Barn. It's a spectacular building with a great history.
The building was started in 1906 and finished in 1909. William Simpson was the owner, and the designer architect was John Coxhead from Buffalo, New York at that time. And they built this fabulous building that's 347 feet long, 50 feet wide, 80 feet to the top of the concrete flagpole. And the aisleway is 20 feet wide, so you can exercise horses inside.
Cuba has a deep heritage of dairy and cheese production, and it was once known as the cheese capital of the world. It's been a top producer of dairy products since the late 19th century. There's a small but very interesting museum in the first floor of the Palmer Opera House here on Main Street that provides a great overview of the town's history within the cheese industry. Beyond being located in one of the most picturesque, magical, and enchanted areas in all of Western New York, Cuba is a town that has resurrected itself out of the ashes of its former self to reawaken with a sense of purpose and place that's simply a joy to behold. There's a real community here that's weathered the storms of the last century and the early parts of this one, bound together and reinvigorated itself with a new path towards a bright future. This episode of Small Town Western New York was made possible by the following supporters.